Today I want to talk to you about my book. This started as my doctoral dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania. We have here a recent graduate from there as well. And it became the foundation for the book that I wrote that came out last year. So there is a pervasive image of Jewish life in Eastern Europe before World War II, in the shtetl, so to speak. There's this pervasive image of Jewish life as being isolated, kind of unchanging, and this idea that kind of Jews kind of lived in a ghetto of Jewish tradition and And in this mythic context of Jewish life, in this kind of myth of the shtetl, the idea of conversions, of Jews converting out of Judaism, of converting to, typically it was Christianity, the whole idea of the convert seemed like it didn't fit with the story or with the narrative of East European Jewish life. So, are some of you familiar with Fiddler on the Roof, with the movie? It's based off of the book this series of stories by Sholem Aleichem, a great Yiddish writer who wrote the Tevye stories. And as we see in those stories, we have a narrative of Jewish parents, of Tevye and his wife, who declare that their daughter Chava, who converted to marry her lover, her Christian lover, they declare her dead to the family, dead to the Jewish people, and then they observe the traditional 7 days of mourning for a close relative. And Tevye tells his wife, and here I have a picture of from a book of the Tevye short stories. Tevye tells his wife, "Let it seem to us that we never had any Chava." And I love this illustration. This was done by a man in California, and it shows, I think, in an interesting way. You have here on this side, you have Chava, you have her new husband, you have the Russian Orthodox Church, the onion-shaped domes in the background, and on the right side you have the grieving parents, the parents who are mourning for this child that is no longer going to be a part of their lives. Though Tevye in this story, in Sholem Aleichem's story, acted or wanted to act as if Chava had never existed, it's interesting to note, and what my research was engaged with, is that the convert, or the meshumad, as the convert was called in Hebrew and Yiddish, the convert actually figured very largely on the cultural map of East European Jews in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Besides the character of Chava in the Tevye stories, there were several writers, Yiddish writers, Russian writers, who used the character of the convert in their stories. This was a character that interested people at the time. The Yiddish writer Sholem Asch, if some of you are familiar with his writings, he wrote an interesting novel called Der Tehillim Yid, which is all about a convert from Judaism, a young woman who converts to marry her Catholic lover. And even Chekhov, the Russian writer, has the character of the convert from Judaism in his writings. And beyond just being a character that populated novels or literary works in the 19th and 20th centuries, there was also just a general kind of popular interest among Jews in the convert in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the Russian Empire. There was actually some scholars or publicists in the late 19th, early 20th centuries who wrote books about mishumadim, as you see here, or about apostates, about converts. The Hebrew and Yiddish writer, an active Zionist, Shmuel Leib Zitron, he wrote one of these popular books called Mishumadim, Tippin in Silhouetten von dem Neunten Over, Apostates, Types and Silhouettes from the Recent Past. This was published in Warsaw in 1923, and I don't remember if it's 2 volumes or 3 volumes, but these are, many of these works were multi-volumes, and they were filled with just stories, biographical sketches of interesting converts, not the famous ones, but just the everyday converts who people were, especially Jews, were fascinated with. I'll give you another example. Shel Ginsburg, maybe some of you have heard of, was a historian. He published a book similarly titled Mishumadim in Tsarist Russland, Apostates in Imperial Russia. He actually wrote it in the interwar period, and it was published posthumously in New York in 1946. But he too published this book, and there were several others like it in the early 20th century, which is interesting, and I share this with you only to just add to this idea that in contrast to the kind of fiddler on the roof idea of the convert as something that's, we don't talk about, the convert's dead, it's not really a part of Jewish society. Actually, there was a lot of interest in the convert amongst Jews and just readers at the turn of the 20th century. Beyond the convert's existence and importance in literature and in journalism, we also learn from the biographies of some famous Russian Jewish cultural leaders or political activists in the early 20th century about the ways in which they personally struggled with converts in their own families. So, an example is Simon Dubnov, one of the earliest historians of Russian Jews. He struggled with the fact that his daughter Olga had converted from Judaism. Some of you might be familiar with Achad Ha'am, a famous Zionist activist from the Russian Empire. He poured a lot of tears and kind of agonized and wrote about the fact that his daughter had, although she didn't formally convert because she was living in Italy at the time and she didn't have to convert to marry a Christian, she did marry a Christian, and for him that was as if she was leaving, right, the Jewish community or leaving the Jewish fold. And the other person I want to just note about the kind of the personal connection is the famous modern Yiddish writer Mendel Mocher Sporim, whose son Meir converted from Judaism as well. So I bring this evidence to argue that conversion was actually a culturally and socially significant phenomenon for Russian Jews, and that converts weren't so easily cut off or cut out from the imagination of Russian Jews or from Russian Jewish life. And so in my research and in the book that came from it, I wanted to ask how Jews in Imperial Russia found both the social and also the institutional means to undergo baptisms in the so-called shtetls of Eastern Europe, which were heavily populated by Jews, which were surrounded by very thick kind of Jewish cultural life. And I also wanted to know how Jewish families reacted. Was Tevye's reaction the only one? Did Jewish families just mourn for the converted family members and call it a day, or was there more Jewish interaction with converts? So ultimately, I was really interested in trying to probe or use the convert as a way to understand the flexibility or the boundaries of Jewish community and how those boundaries were kind of shifting or being redefined or reshaped over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries. So I want to tell you what I'm going to be doing for the next little bit of the lecture. I want to quickly talk about the nature of my sources that I use, the nature of the evidence for a project like this, and maybe give you a little shout out to some of the research I did here in Kiev about 10 years ago. And then I want to share a few stories that can help to, stories from the archives or from my research, that can help to dramatize some of the surprising ongoing relationships between converts and Jews, and the very proactive response of families and communities to Jews who converted out. And so I want to use this evidence to suggest that Jewish society in Imperial Russia was not as homogeneous as maybe the myth of the shtetl would suggest. And it was not as culturally insular as one might have thought. And that ultimately Tevye's mourning for Chava, right, and calling her dead, is not the full story of how to understand converts in Russian Jewish life. So until the partitions of Poland at the end of the 18th century, no Jews were allowed to permanently settle in the Russian Empire unless they converted to Russian Orthodoxy, to pravoslavia. With the partitions and Russia kind of inheriting by accident about 750,000 Jews by the end of the 18th century, these old laws were still on the books, but in practicality, there was now almost 1 million Jewish subjects of the Russian Empire who did not have to convert to become a subject of the Tsar. Legally, Jewish settlement was confined to the Pale of Jewish Settlement, an area of the western borderlands of the Russian Empire that in many ways overlapped with the parts of Poland, Lithuania that Russia had taken over, and also parts of New Russia down in the south that were also became places with large Jewish populations. I have here the Pale of Settlement in green, and then in yellow is the Kingdom of Poland, Congress Poland, which was also part of the Russian Empire, but there were slightly different rules there in terms of governing the Jewish population. So my focus is really on the green part. It's really about Jewish converts from the Pale of Settlement. So before about the era of the Great Reforms in the late 1850s, 1860s, 1870s in the Russian Empire, for the most part, Jews were not legally allowed to live outside the Pale of Settlement. That included Kiev, the city. And the only real way for Jews to leave the Pale was to convert to Christianity. And in cases where a Jew, let's say a Jew, there was a Jewish couple, and one spouse converted to Christianity, they would not be allowed to move outside the Pale unless their other spouse converted. So you couldn't have a mixed marriage of a Christian and a Jew. That wouldn't be enough to be able to leave the Pale Settlement. And we know, though, by the Reform period under Tsar Alexander II, there were some changes to the laws that gave certain Jews exemptions to live beyond the Pale. So soldiers, some merchants, some artisans, students, doctors, some with higher degrees or higher education. And hence, right, Kiev kind of became a legal place of residence for a growing Jewish population at that time. So just a little bit more about context to kind of understand the nature of the evidence. The Russian Empire officially espoused Russian Orthodoxy as the religion of the empire. and the Tsar was an Orthodox, a Russian Orthodox, right, autocrat. But that being said, over the course of the 19th century, after much imperial expansion to the west and also to the east, the Russian Empire actually became very engaged with religious toleration. It officially espoused religious toleration and very much used it as a way to govern its very large empire. It empowered, in many ways, the clerics of different faiths, so non-Russian Orthodox faiths and non-Christian faiths. It kind of co-opted them into governance to help be the record keepers of the vast population, and to help become kind of key instruments in for imperial management. And some of this religious toleration and religious diversity that really characterized the empire was especially pronounced in the areas where Jews lived, in these borderland regions that historically, in some places, had a very large Catholic presence, presence of eunuchs, of Lutherans, all different kinds of groups. So something that really interested me in studying conversions was that it wasn't just about Jews converting to Russian Orthodoxy, but it was about Jews living amongst a multi-religious population. And there's actually materials on Jewish conversions to every faith you can think of that existed in the Russian Empire at the time. I might have even today, or it was actually yesterday, I think came across something about Jewish converts to Islam, because right, there were Muslims as well, Tatar Muslims. So that piqued my interest, but I'm working on a different topic, so I couldn't read it. So this is all to say that religion was significant in the Russian Empire, and that the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, kept statistics on all converts in the empire. So I have here a copy of a published set of statistics by the Russian Orthodox Church about conversions from a variety of faiths to Russian Orthodoxy. Here it goes from 1842 until 1891. Although this is just what I'm showing you, but they have statistics for other years as well. And in yellow, I highlighted the column about conversions from Judaism. So I know it's hard to see from where you're sitting, but here along the side it shows the years, and then along the top it tells you Catholic conversions, Uniate conversions, Protestant, Armenian, and then it's this is the summary of those, and then it goes into various schismatic groups or sectarian groups, and then it shows you Jews, Muslims, and then pagans. So there's actually statistics kept on every single group really in the empire that the church was able to see, so to speak, or to kind of follow. And they kept these records because religion was significant for one's civil status. The Russian Empire was an ancien regime in many ways, and it was an empire where one's civil status was dependent on their religion and their social estate. So this was important because it was important to know how this new convert would be governed. They needed to keep records that convert had left their former society, their former religious group, and was now being governed and part of a new community. So this is partly the reason why there's so many sources out there on Jewish converts or converts from Judaism, because religion mattered and there's a lot of record keeping about it. This is just one example, but from statistics that we have then from the Russian Orthodox Church, over the course of the 19th century, about 70,000 or so Jews officially converted to Russian Orthodoxy, or were reported to convert to Russian Orthodoxy. And we have information from German missionaries who were working in the Russian Empire or throughout Europe that some maybe 15,000 or so Jews converted to other Christian faiths. So the number that historians work with is that there was about 84,500 Jews who converted to various Christian confessions over the course of the long 19th century. But we know that that number is actually quite low, and it's probably way too low, because non-Orthodox, outside of the Russian Orthodox Church, there was not official statistics really kept, so we really have no clue, like in absolute numbers. So we actually think this number is very low. But what's interesting is that scholars of modern Jewish history have focused a lot on converts, but mostly in Central Europe and Western Europe, focused on Jews who converted in Germany or in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But in absolute numbers, really the largest number of converts in modern Jewish history was in the Russian Empire. And of course that makes sense due to how big the Jewish population was here. And of this number of converts, about a quarter converted in the army. So of that number, many, majority were converted forcibly during the very famous or infamous episode under Tsar Nicholas I of the Cantonists, the underage Jewish conscripts who were forcibly converted to Russian Orthodoxy in about the 1840s to early 1850s. But what's interesting to me is that 3/4 of the converts from Judaism were civilians. They were everyday people, many of whom converted in where they grew up, right? Not where they were taken from their home and put into the army. But they converted in the very small towns and villages and where they grew up and where there was very highly developed and tight-knit Jewish communities. So I want to move from here to just touch on one brief question about missionary work. There was long thought in some early writings of Russian Jewish history that the Tsarist Empire just wanted to convert all the Jews, that all of the kind of various laws that were passed about Jews, many of them had one and the same purpose, which was to make all Jews turn into Christians, or specifically Russian Orthodox Christians. But that wasn't the case. Aside from the army, and specifically the Cantonist period, there's actually, in my research, I found a very surprising absence of missionary work done to Jews. The Russian Orthodox Church was much more interested in its own faithful and keeping them faithful, and it was very focused on raskolniki, or schismatic groups. And that's where they put all their efforts. The Jews were not really their focus. Except I'd say that I did research here in Kiev about 11 years ago for my dissertation, and in the archives, in the city archives, you can find records of a local, it's called the St. Vladimir Brotherhood, or Bratstva, that was a kind of local clerical group that was interested in converting Jews. And Jews from around the palace settlement would ask to come to Kiev, even though they weren't allowed to stay here. They would ask to come for 2 weeks, just 2 weeks. Give me 2 weeks and I'll convert. I'll study with the Brotherhood and then I'll leave, I promise. But that was a kind of anomaly. That wasn't typical. There are actually not that many organizations that were really interested in converting Jews, even though Jews so much felt like the Tsar just wanted them to convert. Yeah, okay. I'll leave that there. Oh, I was going to say, ironically, the only really consistent work to try to convert Jews was actually done by foreign evangelical missionaries. So it was really done by Protestant groups from Western Europe. The London Society, if any of you are familiar with that, was active. And then also converts. Many converts from Judaism turned to the church and said, please pay me. I will go convert my former Jews, my former co-religionists. And so I found interesting cases of these Jews who tried to sell themselves as missionaries, and ironically, oftentimes they weren't really taken seriously. There was not really an interest in spending money on that kind of work. So, okay, so I'm just going to skip over the next two to switch to part 2. So I want to reconstruct from you now and to give you, not just talk around the sources, but to really share some sources with you. And I want to talk about some of the drama of some of these conversion stories that I found in the archives. And I worked, aside from material from Kiev, there's a lot of material from Vilna, or from Vilnius, that is actually now located in New York City at the YIVO Institute. And there I found lots and lots of documents about conversion. I did a lot of work in St. Petersburg, in the Imperial Archives, and also in Israel, in Jerusalem, where there's a lot of materials that have been gathered there about Jews from different archives around the world. And the archive there has amazing materials on Russian Jewish history. So how did conversion happen? What's the story behind it? What's the kind of what's the story about sociability? How did Jews find Christianity? And here I want to focus on the tavern. The tavern that was common, it was a common place where Jews worked, where Jews had leases or ran taverns in Eastern Europe. And I found a common thread in many of the conversion stories that I found, that a lot of conversions happen because of relationships of Jews meeting Christians in taverns. And that was because of this, the tavern is this kind of interfaith meeting space, that conversions happened. And I have here this picture. This is it was a picture that actually is at the New York Public Library. It has it in their collection. And it's a picture of a Żydowska karczma, a Jewish tavern, from 1868. And the reason I like it, and it's actually in my book as well, is that it shows here behind the counter a Jewish man, and next to him a Jewish woman, potentially his daughter, who's working there, surrounded by a whole set of male, non-Jewish patrons. And this picture for me sets up a lot of the kind of the social dynamics that I was finding in the archives about how the tavern was the place where many young Jewish women, unmarried Jewish women, found Christian lovers and made the decision to try to convert to Christianity. So I want to share 2 stories. So let me put the map back on so we could just place this in space. The first story is from July of 1871. An 18-year-old Jewish woman named Malka Mendelyova Lynn, holding her baby son, she was asked to give a deposition before the police in Grodno. So here we have Grodno province up here. She was asked to explain to the police why and how she came to the city of Grodno to convert to Russian Orthodoxy. And she explained that she lived with her parents, who were tavern keepers in the town of Bielsk in Grodno province, And in 1870, a year prior, she decided to convert after a Russian soldier she had met in the tavern. They had started a relationship. She got pregnant. The soldier promised to marry her if she would convert to Russian Orthodoxy. She was very nervous about her parents finding out about her pregnancy and what happened. And so she asked the army unit if they could help her get her to Grodno, get her to the city, so that she could find help and a place where she could undergo conversion without her family knowing. So in Grodno, Malka Lynn, she had asked a local women's a monastery or a convent to give her shelter and to help her prepare for baptism. She ended up actually getting very sick before she was able to finish her course of study, and she was able to receive an emergency baptism by the army. She was then, the baptism was approved by the Russian Orthodox Church, and then the typical kind of protocols ensued. She was given 25 rubles as a one-time monetary handout for converting to Russian Orthodoxy. She was officially taken out of the Jewish metrical records, or the records right from her Jewish community. And she was given 9 months' time to choose a new community, a new общество, a new was called in the sources a new rod жизни. She needed to choose a new tax-paying community and a legal estate, a new сословие. So this story was very interesting to me, again because of the tavern. The tavern was this meeting space where you have this Jewish woman who is not just converting overnight and not knowing anything about kind of her about conversion or about Christianity, but she's doing it because she has a relationship that's been nurtured, right? And that is the reason, or that is the platform on which she is now joining or trying to kind of cross the border into this new community. I want to give you one more story about the tavern as this kind of meeting place, where we see the social world of converts. This one takes place a year later in 1872, and this comes from the conversion narrative of a young Jewish woman named Shayna Leibovna Dlugalenska. She also was converting to marry a Christian. And interestingly, her story, she wanted to marry a Catholic man she had fallen in love with. And they both decided to convert to Russian Orthodoxy. I'm not sure why she didn't just convert to Catholicism. But they wrote letters to the police, to local priests, saying that they wanted to convert, please help them. And I want to show you, I actually brought some of the text from this conversion narrative. This comes from one of the files at the Yvo Institute in New York City that originally came from Vilna, from the Russian Orthodox consistory, or ecclesiastic consistory in Vilna. And this is a letter that Shayna Dlugalenska wrote to the Bishop of Brest that first went to a kind of priest in Bielsk. So she wrote, and I'll read it here, right, so you could read along with me. She said, about 3 weeks ago, I found it timely to reveal my desire to the peasants of Kotlov so that they would inform the priests of the Greenyevich Church in whose parish they lived. A week ago, my parents and relatives, having found out about my intention, got involved and threw me in a wagon and already started carting me off in order to do something to me. But to my happiness at the time, the peasants of Kotlov were informed of this. They overtook us, they kidnapped me or took me and brought me to the Belsk police and told them what happened. Even though the state administration promises to give me to these peasants for safekeeping from the Jews, I still fear for my life. A Jew can do a lot, especially those as well off as my father and his brother Tevye the Dairyman, who holds a few arendas or leases in Bielsk district, including for the village of Subotka, where my father runs an inn. Besides this, my relatives are workers in chancelleries, and they know all the tricks in their favor. They already certified to the state that I am 14 years old and promised to confirm this with metrical records of my birth, not minding the fact that I am already 17 years old. So there's a lot going on in this letter that this young Jewish woman wrote to the local priest. But first thing I want to pull out is that she lives in this village because her father runs an inn there, right? She most likely is the assistant there, right? The tavern worker. Typically, it fell to the women of the Jewish home to really do the day-to-day running of the tavern. So she's, it seems that potentially this is kind of a central meeting space where potentially she met this guy that she ended up falling in love with and wanted to convert for. She seems to have a very nice relationship with the local peasant community who want to help her in her conversion. And yet there's something else happening in here as well, which is that she is telling the state, or she's telling the priest, but she's concerned that the Jews are going to try to stop her conversion. And I bring this to you because there's a kind of thread in my work that looks at how conversions happen. It looks at the social relationships and the fact that for so many Jews, they had very close relationships with local Christians before their baptism. But then there's this other theme that emerges from a lot of these stories, which is that of Jewish resistance, or very negative Jewish reactions to conversion, very proactive reactions. And so here, she claims that her Jews tried to stop her, right? They tried to take her, and that it required the local peasant community to get her back. She's nervous that even though now she's back, the police have intervened, she's nervous that her family are going to do something tricky. They're going to do something deceptive maybe, to maybe convince the state or convince the authorities that she shouldn't convert. Maybe she's concerned that they're going to tell the state that she's too young. Right? She says, they say I'm 14 years old, but that's not true, I'm 17. She's concerned something about my relatives are workers in chancelleries and know all the tricks in their favor. I don't know what that means exactly. I think she's trying to use some fancy language to call attention to what's happening. But I think she's nervous about the fact that her family, maybe they know the local rabbi, or maybe she has a relative who's the local rabbi who writes all the records of Jewish births and deaths and marriages and divorces and circumcisions. Maybe she's nervous that they're going to use these records to show the state that she's underage and that she can't independently convert. So there's a lot of interesting things happening here, which serves as a kind of bridge to the other half of my work, or a part of this book, which is looking at not just the social aspects of conversion, about these evidence of friendships, right, between Jews and Christians, which help to nurture conversions. But this whole other theme started to develop as I was starting to read in the archives, and that was a theme of Jewish violence against converts and tensions between Jews and their Christian neighbors about conversions, about local conversions. And you hear this in Lugalenska's narrative, right, the one that she wrote to the local priest. She said, right, I fear for my life. I'm nervous because the Jews are violent. They've already tried to kidnap me. And so this theme of violence is something that comes up in a lot of sources about Jewish conversion. There were a lot of stories in the Russian press in the late 19th, early 20th centuries about Jewish communities who tried to violently stop converts. It was almost like you could find it in all the different presses, whether it be kind of general provincial presses, church presses. There was a common interest in these conversion stories of Jews trying to stop converts. You hear it in some convert records, where converts write to the authorities that they're nervous, that their families are going to do something to them. You see it in court cases, where there are actually cases that came to the courts, where Jews were tried for either trying to kidnap converts, kill converts, or do something physical to them. And you see it in art as well. Are any of you familiar with this painting? So this is a painting by a Ukrainian artist, Nikolai Kornilovich Pimonenko. And actually, for a while, I don't know if it still does, but it was here in the National Art Museum. It is. But I tried going, but it's under construction now. So I really wanted to go myself. But I know so maybe copies of it have gone to other art museums in Ukraine as well. This is a quite famous painting. He's a famous naturalist, right, painter. And this is part of his general au revoir. This one happened is about Jews. And he said that at the time this was inspired by a newspaper article he read about Jews in Kremenets who tried to stop a conversion violently. It was a young woman in the community. She fell in love with a Christian. She wanted to convert, to marry him, and this is what happened. And this painting is it's very arresting. Right, you have the kind of the rural scene. You have the young woman here, and it's hard to tell that she has a cross on her neck. Her clothes are already torn, so clearly there's already been violence done to her. You see here the parents that look like, right, the parents who are more in that mourning state. They don't, they're kind of disowning her. But you see this community here, what looks like a rabbi wearing the talit and the tefillin, who has this righteous anger at her. And you see a group of men who look like they're plotting something, right? They're plotting some kind of reaction to this. So in some ways, this is yet another kind of source or a way to think about this kind of narrative about Jewish violence towards converts that started to emerge in my research. And I found something actually very interesting, which is that Jews didn't just kind of take this story and sit quietly, but actually there are postcards from the turn of the 20th century, Jewish postcards, that took this image, the Pimonenko image, and actually another like it, and they printed it on postcards they would use to send notes to one another, right? It was kind of form of correspondence. And they gave it a new title. Instead of what was Pimonenko's title, right, victim of fanaticism, right, which is a very kind of anti-Jewish title, saying that Jews are fanatics. They're fanatics with violence against their family. Here In the Jewish retelling of it, this one calls it Hamishumeget, right? The apostate. Why is everyone upset? Because she's leaving her community, right? The turn of the language actually tells a different story. It's not about fanaticism or intolerance or craziness, right? It's about what happens when somebody leaves your community. So this one was done by a German Jewish publishing house, and it also has the German thing, Getauft die Juden im Heimatdorf, so the baptized Jewess in her native village. And then here is another postcard which has the Pimonenko picture, again with the Hebrew title Hamishumeget, the apostate. And then another picture of a kind of similar story of rabbis entering a room with a young woman and a man, ostensibly a Jewish woman and her Christian lover. And here it's called Habogedet, the woman, the traitoress, the woman who was a traitor. So again, different language to kind of tell a little bit of a different story, or to perhaps defend the actions of Jewish family and communities in trying to stop conversions. I'd say maybe second half or part of my book looks at these stories of Jewish reactions to conversions, looks at both kind of attempts to physically stop conversions, and then also looks at the ways in which Jews try to use the law or try to use their powers of metrical records, of holding the records of every individual Jew, to try to stop the government or to present obstacles for Jews to be able to convert. So we saw one example in the case of Schainker, that her parents tried saying that she was 14. She's too young. And the local rabbi said, here, I'll show you the day she was born. You know, you can't convert her. So that was a way I found a lot in the archives of communities trying to stop conversions. I found interesting ways in which Jewish names, Jews tended to have a lot of names, right? They might be Chaya Sarah or Dove Bear, right? Jews might have several names, but the way it was written when they were born officially might be just one name. Or maybe they're called, she's Leah, but they call her Leila, right? They add the kind of the diminutive, the kind of nickname. So communities, the police might say to a rabbi, hey, there's this Jew that wants to convert. Have you ever heard of them? Do they live in your community? And the rabbi might say, no, I've never heard of that person. There is no Layla here. I only have Leah. So if we can't find her and we can't take her off the books, then she can't convert.
There are some cases where in metrical books we find on Russian's page we find the one name, and in Jewish page we find the separate name at all.
Mm-hmm.
In Russian there is something like Luba or something like that. But in Jewish, there is Lila or Leah or something like that.
Yeah, and you might have that like the Jewish name Chaim, and then in Russian Vitaly or something like similar meanings but different names, right?
But police can read only Russian one.
Right.
Still sorry, it was a tendency. It's like economic elites who bourgeoisie took some Western or like secular names, like Solomia or something like that.
I work as a genealogist, so I look through the meteorology books a lot, and there is no tendency about the Russian names. The most important that these names are usually nearly the same, Russian and Jewish. But there are sometimes some records where the Russian name is not the same, but not even the same meaning.
Right, interesting. But your question, from the kinds of records I'm looking at, most people did not have didn't necessarily have a Europeanized name. So that wasn't necessarily the issue, but it could be. That could be as well.
The tendency that the Russification of the name is a tendency of 1920s, not the before the revolution. So the people just take.
It was not Russification of name, but most westernization of name.
Right.
Yes, they took bourgeois names. So it was only about economical elites, like the owners of fabrics and so on.
Right. So let's put that aside for a second because I want to just conclude and then we'll start a discussion. And just to give you kind of an example of both these very proactive, right, Jewish ways of dealing with conversion. Again, it's very, very different than the Tevye narrative, which is sitting Shiva and mourning and saying there is no Chava. Actually, right, the records show that Jewish communities were very proactive about trying to deal with conversion and to stop them, both sometimes through force and sometimes through the law, right, in an attempt to use record keeping as a way to kind of talk back or fight the state. And here's just an example of the ways in which Jewish communities were very much brought into the conversion process. Because as I said, one of the first things the police would do is that they would reach out to the rabbi of the Jewish community from which the convert was from, and they'd say, hey, can you find this person's records? So often in the archives, in these conversion files, we find letters from the rabbi saying, yeah, I've heard of this person. Yeah, they exist. Or they say, no, I've never heard of them. But it's just ironic that you actually have rabbis and somebody who are involved in these conversion processes because it comes down to it's a status change, and the rabbis need to be consulted. There's actually something in the Kiev records for the St. Vladimir Brotherhood. There was somebody who wanted to convert, and they were told, before you can convert, you have to go back to your rabbi. Physically, you need to go home, you need to talk to him, and if the rabbi gives you your records, then you can convert. If the rabbi doesn't, you can't convert. So you have these very interesting ways in which these communities, the Jewish communities, because of the record keeping they did for their faithful, that in some ways they could sometimes be in control or have some control over these conversion stories. So this here is just an example. Again, this is from the Vilna archives, but this is a certification by a crown rabbi, by a state rabbi, that enabled a young boy, or a single young male to convert, only because the rabbi put his kind of stamp on it. This was a conversion in 1870 of the crown rabbi of Molodechno. So I want to just wrap up, and I go back to this image because I don't know, I just really like it. But my book, I think, or my research really unsettles or challenge the vision of Jews in the Pale of Settlement as a kind of ghettoized community. And it analyzes the spatial, the social, and the cultural ties between Jews and their Christian neighbors. And using archival files, using the popular press, using novels and memoirs, I argue that baptism did not necessarily constitute a total break with Jewishness or the Jewish community, and that conversion actually marked the start of a kind of complicated experiment with new forms of identity and belonging. And just a note, just to kind of connect it to some strands of conversations today, I noted at the beginning of my talk that at the time, right, in Imperial Russia, there was a lot of conversation about converts. Jews were writing novels about them, they were writing books about them. It was a popular topic in the Yiddish press. So there's a lot of conversation because converts are complicated and they challenge the way people understand who's a Jew, what does it mean to be Jewish, what is Jewishness? Is one still Jewish if they convert from Judaism? And at the time, at the turn of the 20th century, the early 20th century, as we have the rise of Jewish nationalism, Zionism, diaspora nationalism, various diaspora nationalisms. We have the rise of very secularist Yiddish kind of Yiddishist ideas. The converts became a way to kind of think about how people saw the Jewish future. Was the Jewish nation something that was based on religion? Did one have to be Jewish to be part of the Jewish nation? Or was it something more national? Was it more ethnic? So could a convert who had converted from Judaism still be considered Jewish because they were from the Jews, right? They had Jewish origins. And so at the time, there was a lot of different opinions about this. And I want to just close with an interesting, one interesting idea that was put out there at the time. And this was said by Yosef Chaim Brenner, who's a famous Zionist, leftist Zionist. And he wrote in a Zionist newspaper in 1910 that, and this was in talking about the kind of the Jewish future, what Zionists were trying to do in Palestine. He said that a belief in Jesus in no way undermines national Jewishness, even the project of Jewish state building in Ottoman Palestine. And there was, his words were very shocking, that he could say that it doesn't matter who you believe in, but just if it's about building this Jewish nation. It has nothing to do with religion. And actually the newspaper was immediately shut down because the publishers were like, oh my gosh, people got a lot of, people were very outraged by this comment that you could believe in Jesus and still build the Jewish nation in Palestine. And at the time, it kind of marked what are the limits of free speech, right? Can you say anything? Are any ideas, acceptable? And I just close with that because it was this interesting moment, and I think we still hear of it today, especially in the United States, with the U.S. Jewish community is always talking about conversion and mixed marriages and mixed families, talking about the Jewish future. In Israel today, it's a very common question about conversion, especially amongst populations from the former Soviet Union. Israel as a whole is always struggling with its conversion crises. And it's just interesting to note that we can actually, in some ways, the origins of some of these very kind of modern, difficult questions about identity and the complexity of identity actually in many ways already come back to the Russian Empire, where a rising number of converts at the time and Jewish engagement on the ground with conversions and how it affected communities already start to spark some of these conversations about who's a Jew, what is the nature of Jewishness, and how does conversion kind of fit into ideas about community. So with that, I'll close. Thank you very much. And I'd love to hear your questions, comments, ideas, thoughts, whatever. Okay.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Due to your example, it's looked like most of those who did this conversion were women. So do you have any statistics to show us these gender differences, or maybe the age of these people and the location in the Pale settlement and so on?
Yeah. So starting in the 1860s, a majority of converts from Judaism were women. And you could trace that in a lot of ways. I actually look through different areas in the Pale settlement and look through some of the statistics, right, kept by the different churches, and just looked, just did a quick number of men versus women over, the years, and it was true for the whole Pale settlement. So you start to have women out converting more than men, and on the whole, it's hard to say exactly what the typical convert looked like, because there are so many. You have some people who converted who were in the state rabbinical seminaries, right, who were studying to be rabbis, and then you have people like lower class Jews of lower classes who are converting perhaps for maybe some type of economic opportunity, but I do have a lot of cases of women, and especially young unmarried women. So women, who be at that point in life when they are looking to get married. That was common.
To follow up, I guess, it seems that at the level of representation, there are more women there. Is there a certain level of anxiety over women, like more focus on women, just presenting them? Because it's interesting that in this postcard, you have two pictures and both of them are young girls.
Yes. Let's go back to that. Yes. So you're right. Yes, in both, it's about women. It's always about women. So I do, in my book, I do look at that about the focus on women, and is it because in actuality more women were converting by the second half of the 19th century? Or is it because that communal anxieties and anxieties about where a community is going, what's happening to it, anxieties about integration or and change, that they tend to be deflected or reflected in trying to control women and trying to control women's bodies, right? Women's bodies being the kind of the locus of kind of the boundaries, right, of the community. So that is happening there as well. Although what's interesting is that in 1866, in one of the big Russian Orthodox newspapers, there was an article, a very kind of sensational article, about the difficulties facing converts from Judaism in the Western provinces. That was the title of the article. And what is the story they tell to kind of talk very broadly about converts from Judaism? They tell the story of a young woman, a young Jewish woman who works at her family's tavern in the Western provinces. And in the tavern, she talked to people, right? What do you do all day? You serve drinks and you talk. You talk to your clients. And there were a lot of army men who would come through and have drinks. And she heard about the fact that sometimes Jews in the army convert to Christianity. And she was very interested in this. And so the story is about her interest in converting. But what happens before she can convert, her family hears about her desire and they kidnap her, right? They take her and they hide her in the town. They hide her in a mill. And it takes no less than the local gendarmerie. So you actually need almost like army forces to come and to save her and to allow her to convert. And she kind of becomes like the poster child or the paradigm of what conversion looks like starting in the 1860s when the army's not converting Jews anymore forcibly. It's not about men and forcible conversion, but the focus really turns to like voluntary civilian conversions in the everyday. And it starts to focus more on women and vulnerability, right? There's this whole narrative of Jews being vulnerable because Jewish communities try to stop conversions. So there's a politics to it, right? But yeah, so gender plays a lot of interesting roles here.
Please.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for the lecture. It was very informative.
between the conversion in the different parts of the Russian Empire? I mean, maybe somewhere it was more popular. Or
So the statistics, at least from the Russian Orthodox Church, show you by province. Like it gets broken down to a pretty local level, how many converted per year. And so generally, I'd say there were conversions in all of the provinces, in the western provinces. So what I saw as being different maybe is that in the northwest provinces, you had more Jews converting to Catholicism, right? Because those were historically Polish-Lithuanian lands, strong Catholic presence. Kiev, almost all Russian Orthodox, right? There is not, so there is some variability based on the local religious and kind of ethnic makeup, and that affected the kinds of conversions. But I did not see such huge variations in terms of numbers necessarily. The only thing that really sparked huge differences in numbers was during the period of the Cantonists, when lots of young Jewish boys were being converted. And sometimes, depending on where that unit was, that diocese might have thousands of conversions because of the army. So that was the only thing that was very obvious in terms of